Welcome. We're glad to have you here today with us on Election Science Office Hours, which is a webinar and a podcast hosted by the Lynn Center for Science, Society, and Policy, also known as the LCSSP, here at Caltech and moderated by me, Michael Alvarez. Our Election Science Office Hours archive has over 30 episodes, which are listed on the Democracy and Elections section of the Lynn Center's website at https colon slash lcssp.caltech.edu. They're also on our YouTube channel and on Spotify and Apple Podcast playlists. So this will be on YouTube this afternoon and available as a podcast immediately thereafter. Also, be sure to follow the LCSSP on social media for the latest updates on our work. We're on LinkedIn, X, Blue Sky, Instagram, and Facebook. And again, for those of you who are with us live, welcome. We're excited to have you here today. But if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A area in the Zoom, and we'll try to answer it as time allows. I am so excited today because we have as our guest Thad Kousser. He's the professor of political science and associate dean of graduate education at UC San Diego. Together, we're going to talk today about the launch of the Center for Transparent and Trusted Elections at UC San Diego, which is a really exciting development here in Southern California. We're going to talk about misinformation and trust research, which Thad's group and my group are also actively working in. And of course, we're in the midst of this crazy primary election here in California. We'll talk about the primary and maybe even talk a little bit about the top two. So Thad, welcome to Election Science Office Hours, and thanks so much for being with me today.
Thanks for having me, Mike. Excited for the conversation.
So, first off, congratulations on launching your new Center for Transparent and Trusted Elections at UC San Diego. It's a huge deal. 2.5 million from the Election Trust Initiative ETI. 4 years of work ahead of you on this. So, can you tell us a little bit about what the center plans to do? What are the key kind of research questions you're looking to answer? And at the end of 4 years, what does success look like?
Yeah, thanks. So, alongside my center co-director, Lauren Prather, who's a fantastic scholar of comparative politics,
Uh-huh.
who is studying election trust in all these developing democracies around the world, and suddenly that became relevant to the United States after 2020. We have four goals with this center. So the first one is to accelerate and expand the research that we've been doing with a team of scholars at universities across the country done in partnership with election officials. That's all designed to provide rigorous data to support the work that they're doing to try to build trust. After, as everyone saw after the 2020 election, the job of these election officials changed, right? Not only do they have to run trustworthy elections, but they had to actually be transparent about all the reasons, all the safeguards on elections. And so that they came up with a lot of innovative different approaches all across the country. And so we had partners, secretaries of state elections directors, county registrars in places like Georgia and in Maricopa County, Arizona, that were really, the focal points of a lot of this in places like Texas, Colorado, even right here in LA County. They were all dealing with this common problem. They took different approaches, whether that was having public service announcements, whether it was social media campaigns, whether it was well-funded public campaigns to get the word out about trust, election facility tours, and they wanted to know what works, what doesn't work, and what works best. And so that's what we've been trying to do is partner with them to answer those questions, to give them data to help hopefully in a timely fashion so it can inform their work in an election cycle, what works for building trust in the American public.
Mhm.
The second thing we're trying to do at the center is really get the word out more broadly to this huge group of election officials around the country who through their networks, through the national and state networks that we get to go visit and go to their conferences. So we're both going to academic conferences and sending our stuff to peer-reviewed journals, but we're also going to election official conferences all over the country, sharing these results with them and then getting their feedback and their ideas for the next set of questions. And that's our third goal is like have this research be driven by the needs of election officials.
Mhm.
One of the things I learn in all my work is like if you want people to listen to what you say at the end of a project, you need to listen to them at the beginning of a project so that you're giving them information. And then the last thing we want to do is work with this big community, including you, as a big leader in this space, Charles Stewart at MIT, the folks at the Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins, and other collaborators to kind of nurture, build, and broaden this field of scholars working on elections broadly and election trust in particular. So Some of our graduate students are now becoming professors, and former postdocs are becoming professors. And we're also convening a monthly election trust research group, a webinar that meets with scholars and practitioners in this field. And then we've also done in-person meetings where we're bringing together scholars with election officials so they can
Mhm.
create their own partnerships. Those are our goals. And if we advance all four of them, we'll be excited after the next.
So that's success is just
That's
making progress in each of those dimensions.
mhm,
Before we talk about anything else, though, how would someone, if they want to get involved in your monthly meetings,
mhm.
how would they get involved?
Just email me. I'll put you on the list. We have a good number of folks, and I know you. We've had people from your
Mhm.
team, Mitchell Linegar, presenting
Yep.
really exciting research on AI used to do trust. Just send me an email, and we can add you to that group.
Yeah, I will second that. It's a really interesting group that you've kind of curated, and the conversations so far have been fantastic. It's so exciting that have to have access to networks like that because as somebody who's been working at this for a long with the gray-haired time, a lot of this seemed like 20 years ago, 25 years ago, like we're sort of shouting in the dark, and
Hmm.
and now there's all these people working on these areas of election science, and also congratulations to you because you're helping to train the next generation. I mean, you've just kind of alluded to this, but many of your students, right, are now working in this area as either grad students or postdocs or faculty members, and that's just like it's so exciting to see all these people out there, yourself included, building out this new field.
Yeah, it's exciting. We're about to put hoods on a couple of them. We're going to be professors at Georgia, at the University of
Right.
Washington, one who's now at Davis, and it's exciting to see.
That is so exciting. Congratulations. So one of your center's core activities is going to be partnering directly with election administrators to test out these transparency initiatives that you were just talking about. And these are things like public tours of facilities, live stream ballot counting, ride-alongs with election officials, which I think is a really exciting idea. Why do you think that these experiential transparency efforts like this works better than just simply kind of talking at people and telling them that elections are secure?
Yeah, I think in our first round of research, we were testing mostly video messages, and there were a couple different varieties of these video messages. Some of them were really trying to open up the veil, right? This black box that people, when they vote, you just kind of hand your ballot in or mail it in or drop it off at a drop box, and then we don't really know what
Mhm.
happens to it afterwards. And so some of what election officials were doing is just saying, okay, your vote comes in, here are the machines. We're testing them. We're doing logic and accuracy testing. And look, they're not connected to the internet. See these air gaps here, and here's these two observers, one from each party, who are overseeing the process. The videos like that were really strongly effective in survey experiments
Mhm.
you know and videos where sometimes people would say like, oh, I'm a Republican former Secretary of State, I'm the Democratic current Secretary of State, elections are trustworthy, you can trust us. But they didn't provide any of the information. They didn't actually unveil that process. Those weren't effective. And so based uh, you know, well, we had an intuition about it, but these election officials already had a better intuition, and many of them were already doing these sort of high touch experiences to really bring people inside.
Mhm.
So in Maricopa County, Phoenix area, second biggest election jurisdiction, Stephen Richer was doing tours nearly every day throughout the 2024 cycle, bringing in every kind of group he could and spending 2 hours with them, really giving them an in-depth experience, much more, really showing them rather than just telling them to trust elections. And so when people walked into that, they would, take their phone out, scan a little QR code, answer a few questions about trust. When they walked out, they would do the same thing. And
Mhm.
and that was a survey that we were doing, getting this before and after read on their levels of trust. And we saw big increases, especially the people who walked in least trusting. We're seeing the biggest movement in trust. And so now we've expanded that. We're working with Ada County in Idaho, with the Philadelphia city elections, doing similar tours. We're working with groups that are doing tours, not just for the public, but for the state legislators who are making decisions on election policy, who really need to know and understand these protections. And there are also really some really cool projects where, if you think about in-depth experience, being a poll worker, that's the biggest
Mhm.
in-depth experience. That's where you really get to kick the
Right.
tires and see what works. And to study that, Lauren is working with Dan Thompson at UCLA, Josh Farrer at American to work partner with Douglas County that randomizes. They have a jury pool model of being a poll worker, and so they're doing before and after surveys of that to get that randomization and really know whether serving in a jury in a as a poll worker increases trust.
So are you able to do any measurement that's not survey based? I mean, is there anything that you're doing that's observational?
Yeah, so those studies with Arizona have
Hmm.
they're observational, and that has both the increased advantages of these are real people doing a real thing,
Right,
but you also lose the randomization component.
right.
So we paired them with surveys nationally and in Arizona to kind of see how much more trusting the people were who walked into to those tours. They're a little bit more trusting, but not that
Hmm.
much. And then we also, in Arizona, they were doing video tours and then
Hmm.
virtual tours, sort of ones like when you buy a house, you take that 3D tour. They did a version of that, and they did a version with like a local drive time DJ. So we did survey experiments with those as well to kind of bring the cause and effect, nailing down cause and effect, which a survey experiment can do well, but
Right.
also doing the observational study. We did a large field experiment working with the late great elections researcher Bob Stein in Houston, where we partnered with a group that was doing a large scale public information campaign. And so we did a field experiment studying those effects. And then that work that I told you about with Lauren is all, it's
Hmm.
got a randomized component, but it's in the real world and truly observation.
Excellent. That's always been one of the things I've enjoyed about your work, which is that you're always focusing on these really important problems, like really important contemporary problems, matching them up very carefully with these really nice measurement approaches and producing really strong quantitative evidence about what works and what doesn't. And I want to talk specifically about your work on vote count delays because that is a big problem
Mhm.
in today's world. I really find that some of the work you've been doing here is really striking because you find that when voters hear that results are going to take longer than expected to be produced, that trust in election drops significantly, even without any other misinformation fueling the distrust. So
Mhm.
that's a big problem for election officials. So how do you transform that kind of research and that kind of finding into something that an election official can do to try to solve this issue and help bolster trust?
Yeah, so I think the delay, and we're going to have this potentially on display in California, maybe even as soon as the
Mhm.
June 2nd primary, that could be really close. And when it's close, it takes a while to count that vote. That delays a potential barrier for trust in it. And that survey experiment that we did, I think, quantified what election officials already knew, right? But it also showed that there are some opportunities. So I think there are really two approaches that election officials can take towards reducing the mistrust that could come from misinformation when it takes a while to count elections. One is that they are by far the most trusted messengers about elections. We
Mhm.
do survey, and survey after survey, we ask people who they trust. They turn to it's local and then state election officials. Those are the people they trust more than candidates.
Mhm.
They can speak, and if they speak first, so with that study that we did that showed it that in Arizona, where it took a week to call a governor's race, when people learned that, trust went down. But we also showed some of those people a real video produced by the Arizona Secretary of State called
Mhm.
"Accurate Results Take Time" that just explained all the reasons. When people heard that first, they were in many ways inoculated against that decline in trust. A lot
Mhm.
of election officials have taken this, or some were doing it beforehand to kind of message first. So when they're sending out that voter pamphlet, they're putting inserts about, it may take time, you may need to be patient, and here's why that's protecting all of your votes. So one approach is proactive pre-bunking messaging.
Mhm.
The other approach is really working on getting votes counted faster. And so I know you had Kim Alexander on
Mhm.
last week, and we,
Right.
happy to talk about a project that we're starting to work with them to try to help speeding up the count. And that's something that you saw lots of states have taken
Mhm.
approaches, and California is looking at different ways to solve this complex problem of actually speeding up the vote count. I think knowing that delay reduces trust provides another impetus for efforts to make sure that elections are accessible, the vote counts are accurate, but they're done in a
Mhm.
timely fashion.
So what's the project you're working on with Kim?
Yeah, so there's a lot of misunderstanding around why California takes a long time to
Right.
cast votes. So it's really not about those tiny percentage of ballots that arrive after election day, mail ballots. The big problem is that now we're in this election realm in California where you vote, everybody gets a mail ballot, and you either
Mhm.
put it in the mail more often people drop it off at a drop box, or really often they drop it at a vote center or sometimes a polling place. And anytime you do that, your ballot has to get validated with your signature. Right. So you have to go through the full signature verification check that takes a long time. So that's really different. If you walk into a vote center and surrender your ballot and then say, instead, I want to vote in person. You vote in person, they can count your vote like that. If you hand them your ballot, it's going to take a couple days. And that
Mhm.
creates what Kim calls like this pig in the python problem with this
Mhm.
huge mass of ballots that come in Sunday, Monday, or on election day, because we
Right.
all like to vote on election day, even if we're not voting in person. Those ones that come in from drop boxes, dropped at a polling place or a vote center, depending on the county, or put in the mail the last few days, those ones have to go through this signature verification process that takes a long time. That delays the vote count.
Mhm.
So what we're trying to do is get people to turn in their votes earlier in time to be counted by election day by actually informing them something they didn't know, which is that, if you get it in by Saturday at a Dropbox
Mhm.
or a vote center, it'll be counted by election night in most counties. Or if you mail it in a week beforehand, that's in time to have your vote counted by election day. So we're
Right.
partnering with one county to do a field experiment where we're seeing whether just providing this factual information about make your vote count, don't delay a vote today, get it counted by election day by turning it in at these times, make a plan, put this on your fridge, put this date. If you do that we want to see whether that leads more
Right.
people to vote earlier, and that helps allow the registrars to count those votes in time to report them on election night.
So, the social scientist in me, when I hear about these kind of ideas, which sound great,
Yeah.
right, immediately thinks of a collective action problem,
Yeah.
right? So this is a classic collective action problem. And I know we can tell people to do this, but is there some way that we can think about this as social scientists and maybe solve this collective action problem? We know you can solve it through incentives, you can solve it through networks. There's lots of different ways to
Mhm.
solve it, but are there things we can do on top of just telling people to turn their
Yeah.
ballot in early that might help solve this problem?
Well, I mean, I think there's some other steps that could be taken in election administration that may require some more funding or some slight changes into the way the registrars do things that might also speed up the count. But for
Mhm.
individual voters, you're right.
Right.
What we're trying to do is do this thing that makes everybody better off. If I get my vote in early, it'll make everybody. But at the end of the day, my contribution to that is marginal. People
Right.
have this Riker and Orta shit going back to Caltech grades, right? Riker, they know the calculus of voting. They know that if they send it in early, but
Mhm.
nobody else does it, what does that do?
Right.
So we kind of took a deep dive into the organizational behavior literature on this, sorry, not just the social behavior literature on this, and really when you have something like this where I can't force anyone else to do these things. What you want to do is social pressure. Basically,
Mhm.
like we can all get this thing if you do it, and so you can be part of the solution. And the other thing that we've learned that other scholars have taught us from their field experiments is that making a plan and having people write down some plan is the best antidote to procrastination.
Mhm.
So it's kind of like getting this as a to-do list on people's fridge, making voting be part of that.
I just had an idea. I mean, you know that
Right?
green Gerber Larimer study, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Should do something like that this cycle, except on getting your ballot back early.
Right. Say like this percentage of people
Exactly.
in your
Yeah.
community turned it in early. Why don't you join? They got theirs in time. Why don't you do it?
Yeah, I mean, this is a little in the political science
Yeah.
weeds for some folks, but this is a classic study about how social pressure can help get people to turn out to vote. So maybe that's an idea. So,
All right, taking
but
notes.
hey, let's collaborate on this one though.
There you go.
Um, really want to do that. So another thing you've been working on is this real serious problem we have right now in the US of partisan polarization, because you've also been looking at how or whether official messaging from election administrators can kind of break through the political polarization, the partisan polarization that revolves around elections. So, kind of what's the bottom line in your research so far? Can nonpartisan official communications actually help move, say, Republican voters to trust a California election or say Democratic voters to trust a Texas election?
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think what your comment highlights is that election officials, okay, they're bureaucrats, they're public servants, but they also have a partisan identity. Many
Mhm.
secretaries of state run for that office with a partisan identity, and so that kind of entangles our elections with our partisan priors. Um, one of the things we were doing in a study that was recently published in the journal of in the election law journal was looking at this problem of how do you trust other states' elections, right? Because in a world of the electoral college, in a world where Congress may be decided by what happens here and there, not just in our community, we need to trust not only our own elections but other people's elections. And there's
Mhm.
been a long time finding in the elections literature where people really at a high level trust elections in their county or city, and then a little
Mhm.
bit less in their state, and then much less in the nation as a whole, sorry, in other states.
Mhm.
And the idea had been kind of it's about, you trust what you know, and it's about geographic proximity. And our intuition was there's also a partisan proximity here, right? That you really don't trust elections run by the other party because if you don't like their views on abortion and guns and the environment and taxes, you probably think that they're running elections wrong too, right? You kind of fill that in, even though you don't really know how they run elections. And elections like vote counting is really done in very similar ways in most parts of the country. So we
Mhm.
first asked people in this national survey, how much do you trust elections in your state, elections in other states more broadly? But then we asked about how much you trust California and
Mhm.
Texas, two states that really stand for something in America, right? Red and blue, right? And what we learned is that, Democrats do not trust Texas elections, Republicans do not trust California elections, go figure. But like trust falls off a cliff when you think about the other party. And we kind of thought, well, that might mean they'll be impervious to any information, right? That they'll just put up a partisan screen, right? And just not, if you're a Republican in Texas, no one's going to convince you to
Mhm.
to trust a California election. Vice versa for Democrats in Texas thinking about in California thinking about Texas elections. And then what we found, surprisingly, in this survey, where we showed the Texas videos to people in California and Colorado and to Democrats nationally, and the California videos to people in Colorado, sorry, in Texas and Georgia and Republicans nationally, is they actually moved by large amounts, like 10 to 12 percentage point increases, and people said they trusted the elections in those states more after watching those videos. So I think what it shows is that we just have a big vacuum of information about the
Mhm.
safeguards of elections in America. We've never had it explained to us what those safeguards are. And once that back, if well, sometimes we'll fill it with our partisan priors. But if you give people factual information from the trusted messenger of an election official and show them that these are reasonable people doing reasonable things, that can move public opinion much more than we expected going in.
So the idea here is that in the absence of any factual information, people just fall back on their partisan heuristic, like pretty much
Mhm.
anything else in American politics today. So
Absolutely. Yeah.
by filling that vacuum with actual factual information, you're basically removing the need for that heuristic.
Absolutely. And we see big public opinion movements
Big
because of
moves too. I mean
that.
that's some of the bigger treatment effects you see kind of in social science. I mean, it
Yeah.
really strikes me that that's just really a fantastic result. Okay, so there's a billion things on my list to talk about, and of course, one of them we have to talk about is the primary, because we've got this primary here in California coming up on June 2nd, and you and I have both studied this
Mhm.
primary
Oh,
since
that's
day one.
right. I remember we at the beginning of my career, right? It was when we're that blanket
The
primary that you were
blanket
doing all the
primary,
work
yes.
in. Yes, I forgot you and
People
Andy.
have been
Yeah.
experimenting in California with primaries for a long time, and it's been, through the course of, I think that's how we first interacted,
Hmm.
was on issues about the blanket primary. And this primary is I'm not teaching right now, but I'm looking forward to teaching in the fall because, the primary that's going on right now is one of the most kind of fascinating kind of political science case studies about the top two that I've seen in quite some time. We've got a large and really fragmented Democratic field, two relatively strong Democrat or Republican candidates, one of whom I think is kind of starting to take the lead. Um, but there's still this possibility that no Democrat could make the top two. So, was this how this thing was supposed to work, this top two, or is this kind of a bug instead of a feature about the institution?
It's clearly a bug. There's There are lots of reasonable arguments in favor of the top two primary, right? This idea that came out of actually a Supreme Court decision by Antonin Scalia, right? Who was outlining here's a
Right.
constitutionally permissible way to open up a primary to everyone without violating a party's associational rights. It was embraced, by moderates like Abel Maldonado in California, who thought it would be a route towards elevating moderates. Has that hasn't we you know
Mhm.
there's some academic debate on that, but it hasn't clearly moved the needle massively in that and stopped our long march to polarization. So there were reasonable arguments in favor of the top two primary, but nobody argued that we should have essentially a wrong winner election, right?
Mhm.
Which the top two, this quirk of the top two creates this opportunity for people to when you have a majority, even a very solid majority, you can have 60% of a district or the state voting for one party. But if that vote is spread across so many candidates and the other 40% is divided
Mhm.
evenly between two candidates, it can guarantee a November victory with no chance, with no write-in candidate, no way to break the glass. That could lead to the potential for having someone elected who just doesn't have the majority support. And I don't see any kind of fair-minded Democratic argument, small d
Mhm.
Democratic, that supports that. We've seen this happen
Mhm.
in a lot of state, legislative and congressional
Right.
races. So it's happened over and over again. It was an unintended consequence, but it wasn't unanticipated. This is something lots of us were talking about. Like
Mhm.
21 years ago, I wrote an op-ed warning about this when it was an idea in the 2005 special election that Arnold Schwarzenegger called. So this is something that has been a feature, like it or not, of the top two primary. There's some talk of abandoning the entire system to do that, or looking at things like allowing write-ins and other ways of getting around it. But it's a possibility that we're
Mhm.
probably, not what's going to happen, but we'll see on June 2nd. But it's already led some Democrats to win in Republican leaning districts and Republicans to win in Democratic leaning districts across California. And I can't really see a good argument in favor of that.
I honestly think with our increasingly heavily partisan gerrymandered districts here in California, which
Mhm.
I'm still kind of concerned about what's going to happen, despite the
Mhm.
fact that, we've been told that we're going to return back to the Citizens Commission, that we may still continue with partisan gerrymandering. I suspect this problem is only going to worsen, right,
Mhm.
for legislative and congressional races
Mhm.
as well. So, it's going to be fascinating to watch what happens between now and June 2nd. Um,
Mhm.
so yes, you've been working on the top two since I think you started your career. What if you had some advice for people who are interested in just following the election, the California primary in particular? What are things that people should be kind of watching for on and after? Is there something in particular that, like a particular kind of vote share threshold or some kind of county type patterns that you'd advise folks to look for kind of early warning signals as to whether the Democrats or the Democratic candidates might be shut out of the gubernatorial race in the top two?
Yeah, well, this is kind of the race for 20%, right? That looks like the key number, right? If typically about 40% of of the state breaks votes for a Republican. And so the Republican route towards getting two candidates into the top two is to pretty evenly split
Right.
that 40% at about 20%. So there are a few so look to see if those Republican candidates are near that 20, both of them are near that 20%. And then Democrats need to have one person pull away. Two would be
Mhm.
fine for Democrats, but they just need to have at least one person pull away way above 20%. So I think looking for that key number of 20%, that's a big threshold. Second thing is, be patient because different types of votes are going to come in at different times. Right.
Right.
So not only does California take a while to count votes, it counts votes in a non-random fashion. It brings, here are going to be the people who voted in person on election day. That's a different group of people who vote in different ways than the people who voted by mail or at drop boxes a week ago, who will be the next tranche of ballots to come by. And so I would say rather than sort of only looking at the numbers, look at the gaps
Right.
between
Okay.
the leading candidates in each party. Look to see if Steve Hilton's putting distance between himself and Chad Bianco.
Right.
If that's the case, Democrats will be cheering for that because it means Republicans are not perfectly evenly splitting their support. And then also look to see if one Democrat or two Democrats are really distancing themselves from the field. So even though the overall blue versus red mix is going to change over time, those differences within the party I think are going to be indicative even in the early returns.
Okay. That's great advice. And thanks for that. Now, it probably is going to be a close race, though, because there's so many candidates and they're going to be
Yeah.
splitting slivers of the electorate. So it could take us a while to know who the top two candidates are going to be moving on to the general election in the fall in the gubernatorial race. And of course, we know that some of these number of congressional races here in California are going to be really tight and really close and could be the races that, I don't know if they'll decide the House. We'll see what the magnitude
Mhm.
of the potential changes nationally might be, but they could be determinative. How do you think that the long count that we're likely to see in California in June is going to be covered by the
Yeah.
news and the media? And do you think that's going to further erode trust in California elections?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a dress rehearsal for the fall, right? The stakes
Okay.
aren't going to be quite as high and quite as national, but the eyes of the country are on California because people always look at California, and especially with this potential that the biggest blue state might elect a Republican. There will be a lot of attention on California. They're likely to be, if things are still close and we don't know the day afterwards who the winner is, and things change as they naturally will as new and different types of votes come in, the voting totals will change. That's going to open the door to misinformation. And
Right.
the real question is how much can trustworthy messengers get out
Mhm.
factual information, and how much does that inoculate against that? I
Mhm.
think with the traditional media, we're seeing a lot of attention and education on this, where people really have a good idea
Mhm.
of what's going on. I think things like Ned Foley's work on the Big Blue Shift that really put
Mhm.
in people's mind that there are good reasons why vote totals should change and shift more towards the blue direction, towards more Democrats doing better as that vote count goes on. I think that has helped with the traditional media, but as we all know, people aren't just following the traditional media. They're getting their news on social media. We ask about, people go towards, we ask who you trust about elections. You go to election officials, you go to your local radio, you go to your local TV. But then at about 5% of people, they're getting it from AI, from TikTok, from all these different sources that put together bring in a lot of information. Some of that is traditional media being shared on social media and it filtering down. Some of that is people who really don't have the background on
Mhm.
elections. And some of the most recent work that our group has been doing, Jennifer Gaudet and Mac Lockhart on our team, they've pioneered this work looking at vertical videos and showing that vertical videos about elections can swing people's trust just as much
Mhm.
as ones produced by election officials. That could be good for trust building. It could be bad for trust decreasing. And so figuring out ways to get the information out about what a vote delay means to those
Mhm.
content creators in those spaces that are now the predominant information source for younger voters.
Mhm.
That's going to be vital. And it's something that our center and other centers are kind of looking at different approaches to doing.
Right. So for the June Farm, do you think it's too late to do that kind of inoculation?
I, I think so. I think like going towards the content creator world, that
Right.
that that groundwork has not been laid. I think that's potentially something that
Mhm.
could be done heading into the fall. I think June is going to show us where some of the vulnerabilities are. If
Good.
there's a slow count, and they'll give people the chance to figure out where we need more factual information.
Okay. Okay. So good. So June is kind of an experiment, like you said, a kind of a dry run to see where the gaps are, and then fill those gaps in November when it's probably going to be much bigger issue with the national media covering how slow California is to figure
Yeah.
out these congressional races, right?
Yeah.
So, you've been studying California politics for a long time, and you wrote this great textbook. So people were talking about elections, but you are like one of the authorities in California politics and political institutions in California, and you wrote this book, The Power of American Governors, which is really fascinating work. And one of the key things in there, at least in my opinion, is that you show that governors often win budgetarily on their budgets, but lose importantly on policy. Now we're talking about a governor's race here. Our current governor Newsom is, obviously termed out and he's exiting. We are going to have a very different governor, no matter who it is, whether
Mhm.
it's Republican, Democrat, or who. How much does the governorship matter for election administration policy in California? And maybe can you speculate on some things that might happen depending upon, some of these candidates and who might get elected in the fall?
Yeah. If there's any lesson in American politics over the last 18 months that's crystal clear, it's that executives can exercise a whole lot of power
Hmm.
through executive orders and through their direct control of the executive branch. And I think uh, uh, governors as well as presidents of both parties are going to take note of that, and in some way, even if they're not using it for the same purposes as this president, they're going to use some of the same practices.
Hmm.
Um, if you look at elections and the role of governors, really, governors shouldn't have much of a role in elections, especially in California, right? Elections are really administered at the county level, and the legislature has a lot of oversight working with the governor. There's a separately elected
Hmm.
Secretary of State who is the main player in elections at the statewide level. And so, over the long term, it hasn't been an area where governors have been tremendously active, but Gavin Newsom was. Right.
Hmm.
So think back to COVID. Remember in the spring,
Hmm.
like 6 years ago in spring in May of 2020, Gavin Newsom issued an executive order to mail a ballot to
Hmm.
every voter. Now the legislature eventually then passed a bill backing that, but it was really the governor using his ability to go first and set the agenda that pushed California into statewide
Hmm.
adoption of this practice. And just a few weeks ago, he sent a letter to registrars saying, hey, folks, the eyes of the nation are on us. Let's count these ballots faster. Now, whether that means he's giving them tools or legislation to do so is less clear. But he has tried to he has waded into this issue. And I think you'll see whoever the next governor will know that they may have to, in part because Donald Trump has also waded into this issue, and California often sees itself as a counterbalance. So if you have a Democratic governor, I could see them taking action to ensure that states' voter rolls aren't turned over to the Department of Justice that may use faulty measures to take people off the voter list based on suspicion of their citizenship. That will be something that a Democrat would be very likely to do. If Chad Bianco's the next governor of California, or
Hmm.
Steve Hilton, I mean, Chad Bianco sees ballots as sheriff in Riverside. Steve Hilton has very often echoed some of Donald Trump's approaches, and you could see either of them taking a different approach, more in line with what Donald Trump has done.
Yeah, you don't really hear much about election administration in California's elections in the primary right now.
Hmm.
But I do think that as the shape of the election, as the makeup of the candidates, right, and who they are, as we get closer to the general election, I think we are going to hear more about election administration from some of these candidates.
Hmm.
So we'll just have to wait and see. Uh, okay, so we're getting close to 40 minutes, and I told you I'll keep you at 45,
Right.
but I still got a couple of questions for you. The one that I really wanted to talk about, and it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, which is that right now you have been for the last decade training really the next generation, right, of social scientists who are working in election science. And one of the things that you've done over the course of your career is, you've really worked on these really important problems in California American politics that are really at the intersection between academic research and in real world politics and policy. Um, and the work that you've done in certain areas like ballot initiatives and vote by mail are actually being reflected in policies that we see here in California. And you're doing the center now that's supposed to be working to get all of these things into the hands of practitioners. So, how do you go about teaching, training this next generation of scholars to really be translational in their work? And what advice do you have for other young scholars who really want to be like you and work on these very translational kinds of questions?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I mean, it's something where a lot of us we get into this business because we want to do engaged work
Right.
that seeks the truth and uses to make a difference in the world. But then you get in to the profession, and there are a lot of day-to-day professional incentives that can take you away from that towards important things. And so I think not losing sight of kind of why you got into this is important. But I think you also need to recognize that like what's our added value as academics compared to just people at think tanks or people who in the
Hmm.
general public who know a lot about politics? It's that rigor and independence,
Hmm.
right? So you've got to preserve that if you want anyone to if you want to have a sort of a special claim to legitimacy and really want people to pay attention to your work. So I've always followed kind of what I call like the GAO model, right? Which is you work with people to come up with policymakers to come up what are the questions, and then
Hmm.
you got to go out and answer them independently.
Hmm.
In a way that's rigorous, that you're sending off to peer review. So, our group has published like 6 peer-reviewed papers. We're
Hmm.
always doing that to make sure, because, why should we have the confidence to bring anything to the public that our peers wouldn't support? So you need to have that layer of independence and rigor, but then
Hmm.
you need to re-engage. Once you're done with a project, brief your partner on it, get their
Hmm.
feedback, hear what they, but then don't, you've got to have the results be the results. And you got to put those out both in academic worlds, but also make them translatable, whether that's a two-pager, whether that's a short video, whether that's testifying in a hearing, whether that's being part of an initiative campaign. If the data take you somewhere, stick to that, be courageous and go into the political thicket with those findings. And it gets a little bit messy and there's a little bit more friction than we normally have in the classroom or in our journals, but it's worth it for that impact that's the reason that drove us all to this profession in the first place.
Mhm. So how do you do that listening and maintain that loop that you're talking about listening, engagement, and sort of following up, um, while maintaining the integrity of your independence? I mean, how do you teach a
Yeah.
graduate student, or what kind of advice can we give to, say, like assistant professors who want to do this? Because again, you're right, maintaining your independence is crucial here. How do you
Our
do that
graduate
while
students.
also being engaged?
Yeah, I mean, our graduate students are in the room with us or in the Zoom with us when we're working with our partners.
Yeah.
And with those partners, you got to have explicit conversations from the first about the ground rules. Like, look,
Yeah.
we're going to do this research. It's going to be this experiment. It may turn out the way you like, it may not. Right. And you've got to live with that. And we've got to agree that we're going to go public with this, but we're going to make a commitment. We're going to take it to you first and hear your feedback on it. And so
Mhm.
that approach that we take is something where our graduate students are part of it. And sometimes they're leading these partnerships. And or leading the paper on them. So they're seeing that and it's part of just part of the apprenticeship that you would do with teaching people how to use a maximum likelihood approach, right? And you do it and learn by doing and do it alongside you. And the good thing is our partners are willing to take that because they don't want to do things that don't work. They
Mhm.
don't want to waste resources,
Right.
waste public tax dollars, or waste their time on trust building activities that are ineffective. We found some things that don't work, and they've pulled
Mhm.
back from campaigns that they were going to fund, stopped doing things, shifted from this advertisement to this advertisement, and so they do want to know the truth along with us. We found by and large.
So one of the questions that I often get from younger scholars is just, how do you get your foot in the door in the first place? I mean, you're super successful at this. So what's the advice for, a young scholar who really wants to engage with their, a local election official or a
Mhm.
policymaker in elections? How do they get their foot in the door in the first place?
You've got to go to those folks and you've got to like build trust with them. So Charles Stewart convened a group to talk about this, and one election official, she said, "I'm not going to trust anyone who I haven't had lunch with." And you've got to like get to know folks. I found it really effective to go to their conferences, to meet
Mhm.
them on their turf rather than just inviting them to your world.
Mhm.
And you've got to have a value proposition for them where they see
Right.
something that you're not just extracting data from them that then you're going to go and bash them over the head with. You're partnering with them on that project so that's going to answer their questions. But it is hard to make that first approach. And so one of the things that we're trying to do with the Center for Transparent and Trusted Elections at UC San Diego is convening conferences
Mhm.
that do matchmaking where we have both groups, election
Mhm.
officials and academics. We give them where sometimes they're in different rooms, sometimes they're in the same room, and they're always doing meals together. And at one of them that we did jointly with Hopkins in DC, we all went to a baseball game, do a Nationals game together.
Mhm.
Like that's how you build the relationships, the trusted relationships that will allow you to research going forward. And so bringing more young scholars into that world is a big goal of our center.
That's fantastic, and I'm really excited to see how this all works out, because I do think you're doing a great service to election administration, but also to academics who work in this area.
Well,
But the
thanks so
core,
much. And your office hours and all the work that you and the
well,
pioneers of this world have been doing, has set an example because it has been a lot in partnership with election officials.
thank you for that. I mean, it's we're also standing on the shoulders of previous generations of giants too. But it's an interesting world we're in, because we're really I'm just, every day when I crack open a journal, look online and see some of the new research that especially the next generation is doing. The generation is, a couple of
Hmm.
generations behind you and I.
Hmm.
I'm just blown away by it, including the work of many of your students.
Hmm.
It's just a fantastic
Yeah.
time to be an election scientist. So last question, it's a big one. It's an important one, I think, because you've been studying this question about institutions earn and lose public, how they earn and lose public trust. we've talked about a bunch of things. We've talked about transparency, delays, partisan polarization, messaging, reforms, lots of things. What gives you the most confidence about the future of the election legitimacy in our country? And what keeps you up at night? You're a very optimistic person. I know. I love that about you, right? But
Yeah.
but what do you think is gonna work in this election cycle to kind of keep trust high? But what are you most concerned about?
I think that the central thing that gives me hope is the inherent trustworthiness
Mhm,
of American elections. They're not perfect. There are mistakes made, but overall, we have this on both sides of the aisle. Republicans, Democrats, and nonpartisan election officials are these deeply committed public servants who I've
mhm,
really been inspired by getting to know them throughout all this research, who are really trying incredibly hard to do the right thing. So objectively, elections in the United States should be trusted.
mhm,
And if you elevate the voices of the people who really know what they're doing and give the public the facts, we have all these studies
mhm.
showing that that
Right.
increases trust. So that makes me think that fuels the optimistic side of me. But you're right. Like I've been up at night more in this research program than any other before because you have a lot of candidates and leaders who aren't staked in the objective facts.
Mhm,
They care about they see that shifting public perceptions about this can benefit their
mhm,
personal political cause or their policy goals. And so they're going to be aggressive
mhm,
and dishonest, plainly. And so that's a real worry. It makes it a challenge for the election officials to get their messages out.
mhm.
And they need every bit of support that they can get. And so that's why, we're really grateful, Lauren and Prather and I, to have this opportunity to support election officials around the country, to do it with facts and objective analysis, because what they're doing should be trusted.
Mhm.
And that's I think the hope for this facet of American democracy right now.
Well, I share your optimism, and so I look forward to seeing what happens in June and in November. And I want to applaud you for all the work you're doing in this area. And congratulations again on your new center. And I'm really happy to be part of it in whatever way I can, including participating in your monthly events. So I'm just really excited to see the work that you're going to do.
Absolutely. Well, great. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks for all the work you've done in this and with this podcast and with your team. And look forward to seeing you at the next conferences.
Absolutely, and look forward to catching up after the primer.
Absolutely. All
All right,
right.
thanks, Dad. Take care.